argument from design for the existence of God. The first premise is that there are many things in the natural world that are intricately and purposefully structured. But, second premise, only an intelligent designer could create intricately and purposefully structured things. Therefore, the conclusion, there is an intelligent designer and creator of such things. We saw last time that there are two serious problems with this argument. The first is that it commits the mother fallacy in concluding that all complex organisms and organs had the same intelligent designer. The second problem is that Paley's assumption that no natural force or process could possibly have brought complex organisms and their organs into existence, because their complexity and purposefulness require an intelligence that no natural force or process exhibits, is false. There is such a process, evolution through natural selection, which was discovered by Charles Darwin. Let's take a close look at Darwin's theory. Charles Darwin was an English biologist who lived from 1809 to 1882. In 1859, he published a book called On the Origin of Species, in which he set out his theory of evolution through natural selection and offered evidence for it. This theory has become the basis for all of modern biological science. Darwin maintained that all life on Earth is descended from a common ancestor. Part of the evidence for this claim is that all known forms of life on Earth are based on the same fundamental biochemical organization, that is, genetic information encoded in DNA. He also claimed that complex organisms arise or evolve from simpler organisms by the process of natural selection. To understand how evolution through natural selection works, it's helpful to compare artificial selection, which is otherwise known as breeding. Consider dogs. All dogs have a common ancestor, the wolf. That's right, all dogs. How did this happen? How do you get a Chihuahua from a wolf? The answer is that we made it happen, by selecting puppies with desired traits and letting them breed when they're adults, while preventing the others from breeding. It took a long time to get from the wolf to the Chihuahua, the Border Collie, and the Great Dane. First, wolves had to be domesticated, that is, convinced not to kill us and eat us, and breeders had to wait for the characteristics they wanted, or that they saw and liked, to occur naturally. Natural differences between offspring and parents occur as a result of changes in the DNA that's passed from one to the other. These are known as mutations. The word mutate simply means change. Changes in DNA can result in changes in the structure, function, and appearance of offspring. Sometimes these changes are good for the organisms, sometimes they're bad. And sometimes they're neither good nor bad for the organism itself, but good or bad for us, depending on what we want. Here's an example. Labrador retrievers are originally an English breed. English labs look like this. Notice that this dog is thick, with short legs, a big, fat, beautiful head, and a thick tail. It's even got webbed toes for better swimming. Americans, obsessed with thinness, didn't especially like the way they looked, though they liked their personalities, which are, of course, totally awesome. So, to satisfy these poor, misguided Americans, breeders crossed Labradors with German short-haired pointers to yield a new subbreed, the American Lab. Crossbreeding has also produced such oddities as Labradoodles, Golden Doodles, Puggles, and who knows what else. With natural selection, the choices are made by environmental conditions, which can be better or worse for individuals with a particular characteristic compared to others that lack it. The characteristic can make it easier or more difficult for the individuals that have it to avoid predators, find prey, and reproduce. Here's a famous example. Industrial melanism. In Manchester, England, in the late industrial age, there was a species of moth, the peppered moth. This moth came in two varieties, the white-bodied peppered moth and the black-bodied peppered moth, which was a naturally occurring variation. Before industrial pollution from coal-burning factories, the white-bodied moths were well camouflaged against trees in the area. Since being well camouflaged made them harder for predators to detect, the white moths flourished. Under these conditions, in contrast, the black moths stood out against the bark of the trees and were easier for predators to detect. So there were relatively fewer of them than the white ones. However, soot from coal-burning factories blackened the trees. This made things much better for the black moths, which were now much better camouflaged and much harder for predators to see. The color that was a disadvantage for them in the old environment became an advantage for them in the new environment. Exactly the opposite was the case for the white moths. Now it was they who were much easier for predators to see. Because environmental conditions changed to favor black moths, the number of white moths decreased. Many of them got eaten before they could reproduce, while the number of black moths increased. They didn't get eaten before they reproduced. So the balance of white to black moths changed. Now it's very important to keep in mind that these are not changes in individuals. No individual moths changed their color. These changes are changes in the overall population. Eventually, there would be no or very few white moths in the new environment. It's also very important to bear in mind that it's not that the moths were made black in order to do better in their environment. It's that they did better in their changed environment because they were black. The fact that there were any black moths at all in the area was due to natural genetic variation. The black moths got lucky because the change in the environments was good for them. Likewise, the white moths got unlucky. There was no purpose or design behind the changes that occurred. Now, unfortunately, there's some doubt about this story. There's doubt that it's actually true. Some scientists suspect that someone pinned a black moth and a white moth on the blackened tree and took a picture of them. Then they made the whole story up. It was a hoax. But this doesn't really matter for us because it might have happened, and it's a good illustration of how species can change over time in response to environmental pressure. Here's a certified true example of fast-track evolution, namely the inadvertent breeding of drug-resistant strains of microorganisms. As antimicrobial chemicals, for example antibiotics, are more widely and frequently used, any organisms with natural resistance to them come to dominate their populations, which will then become mostly or entirely drug-resistant. This is an evolutionary process that can take place fairly quickly. Your doctor will tell you to complete your entire course of treatment with antibiotics, even if your symptoms are completely gone. We don't want the toughest bugs, who may hold out longer than the others, to survive and reproduce. This would mean more tough bugs, making successful treatment of infections more difficult or even impossible. Here's an example that Darwin discovered in the Galapagos Islands. The finch is the only species of bird found on the islands. Over time, they spread out and adapted to different environmental conditions. In particular, their beaks changed depending on the food sources in their environments. Those whose main source of food was seeds came to have beaks like this. Those that ate buds or fruit came to have beaks like this. Likewise for finches in the other environments. The finches born with a different kind of beak that made it easier for them to eat also had an easier time reproducing. So their beak type came to be the dominant one in their particular environment. Again, remember that no individual finch changes its beak in response to environmental conditions. The changes were random variations due to naturally occurring genetic mutation. Whether or not a particular kind of change confers advantage in a particular environment is an accident. New traits arise through genetic mutation. If they confer advantages, the offspring of those who have it will inherit those advantages. Advantages include increased safety from predators, increased efficiency in finding food, and more opportunity to reproduce. And their offspring, in turn, which there will tend to be more of, will also inherit the advantages. And again, it's not that the finches were given new beaks so that they could thrive in their new environment. They thrived because they had those beaks. The birds that didn't have them didn't do so well. They got outcompeted or crowded out. Likewise, it's not that fish were given underwater lenses in order for them to thrive. Rather, they thrived because they had those lenses. The fish that didn't have them didn't do as well. They got outcompeted or crowded out. And again, there was no purpose or design behind the changes that occurred. Paley's claim that there's no possible natural force or process that could possibly produce something as complex as a human being or the human eye is false. But his inference about the watch depends on it. We know that watches are made by watchmakers, but unless we assume that there's no natural process that could possibly produce one, we can't conclude that some particular watch must have had a watchmaker. Paley's assumption that such things come into existence just as they are all at once is also false. But his inference about the watch depends on it too. We know that watches are made in a relatively short period of time. But unless we assume that the human eye came into existence all at once, exactly the way it is, we can't say that it's like the watch in this respect. But there is good evidence that things like eyes and other complex organs, as well as complex organisms, evolved over long periods of time. Older organisms, those found in fossils, are for the most part much simpler than contemporary organisms. Evolutionary selection explains how such complex things could develop from much simpler things over very long periods of time. Greater complexity is associated with greater efficiency and new capabilities. For example, the evolution of the complex eye of the octopus, which is a lot like ours, from a simple pigment spot in a much simpler organism. Take a moment to look closely at this diagram. Notice how the basic design is modified in different species over time. So there's an important disanalogy between watches and human eyes. Watches come into existence in a single act of creation. Human eyes do not. They evolved over hundreds of millions of years. Sometimes evolution through natural selection, operating on two populations of a given type of organism in two different environments, can bring about so many changes that one population can become a different kind of organism, a whole new species. This process is called speciation. It can also happen within a single environment. Changes conferring advantages can accumulate. This is how, beginning with single-cell organisms, millions if not billions of years ago, we can end up with a huge number of different kinds of organisms, that is, the animals and the plants we have today. Now, Darwin's theory is just that. It's just a theory, but it's overwhelmingly confirmed by all kinds of evidence. And nobody thinks it explains everything about life. For example, it doesn't explain the possibility of evolution. That is, it doesn't answer the question, why is the world, why is matter such that life is possible at all, and such that life can evolve over time? Distinguish between global design and local design. Global design appears in the nature of the universe and of matter itself. It includes the fine-tuning of the laws that allows for the possibility of life at all. Darwin's theory isn't supposed to explain this overall design of the universe. It's not supposed to explain how it is that life can emerge and evolve in our world. It's meant to explain local design, which is the appearance of complex organisms within our world. It's also not meant to explain why and how genetic mutations happen, though this can be done by other theories. And notice that it wouldn't make sense to try to offer a Darwinian explanation of the nature of our universe. It doesn't make sense to talk of universes competing for existence or having competitive advantage in an environment. The universe is all there is. Can we therefore conclude that there is an intelligent designer of the universe as a whole? Well, Darwin showed that the appearance of design does not in general entail the existence of a designer. So it doesn't follow from the fact that the universe is just as it needs to be in order for life to appear and evolve that there must be an intelligent designer of the universe. There has to be independent evidence for an intelligent designer. Nor can we conclude from the fact that we think complex life is good, that is, that we think that a universe with complex life in it is better than a universe without complex life, that it must have been created by an intelligent, benevolent designer. Maybe there are infinitely many other undesigned universes, many of which are boring or lifeless or empty, and many of which are much better than ours. And the fact that we live in this one has no explanation at all. No one put us here, and no one planned anything. This is very dark. But what's the argument that it isn't true? In any case, the moral of the story for Paley is that his argument contains a premise, namely that no natural force or process could possibly produce something as complex and purposeful as, say, the human eye. That's false. So it's not a good argument. Now, can we conclude from the failure of Aquinas' and Paley's arguments, and also the many other arguments that we haven't looked at, for the existence of God, can we conclude from the failure of these arguments that there is no God? No, this doesn't follow. You can't conclude from the fact that no one has proved something to be true that it's false. But it does look like maybe it's beyond the capacity of human reason to establish conclusively that such a being exists. And indeed, most philosophers have given up trying. And there's also widespread agreement that no philosophical argument can appeal to God or God's existence to establish its conclusion. So, is there room for faith that's not based on logic? Of course. The history of philosophy shows that the existence of a God can't be established beyond all doubt, using reason. But neither can the non-existence of such a being. So, one is free to believe in God or not, as far as reason is concerned. And the philosopher's advice in the end is this: believe in God if it makes you happy, brings you comfort, brings meaning to your life, etc. But remember, it's possible that you're wrong. So don't get to thinking that anyone who doesn't believe or doesn't believe as you do must be wrong or evil. And also, don't kill them.